Hey guys, what's up? Misha from GGD here, and today I'm going to show you how I go about mixing in Cubase using just the stock plugins. We're using Cubase 10 because that's the latest version. I'm also using Invasion, the latest version of Invasion with the CPU scaling and the other improvements. Let's just jump right in. Let's hear how this sounds. This is just using, so you can see here, the stock plugins. I have the old plugins I was using deactivated, but these are just the stock Steinberg plugins that come with Cubase. Anyways, you get the idea right there. It's this old demo of mine called Foof. So let's take a look at what's going on over here. Well, I guess let's start with the kit first. So as I said, this is the Invasion kit. It's based off of my Snapshot, Misha's favorite kit, Raw, which means that we do not have any turbo going on. I like turbo a lot, but I just kind of wanted to show how good these samples sound even without any extra processing on our end. And it's also a little easier on the CPU. The turbo processing is easier on the CPU. My computer is pretty powerful. Maybe some of you watching can't run turbo as efficiently as I can, so I figured I'd also not run that so that you can follow this along. You could copy this exact setup if you so desire. So looking at all that, I think the main thing I swapped out was a snare. Might have changed some of these cymbals around. But I mean, these samples honestly sound great. We've got, you can see here with the Star Classic Babinga, and I've got the Hulk Smash kick trigger, and we're using the Vinnie Paul snare and the Beef Town. I wanted a nice beefy snare drum for this. The Yamaha low tune toms, and this is the cymbal complement that I'm using. You can see how I've got everything routed out here and mixed, and obviously we are using multi-out routing. So let's start with a master bus, which may seem like a strange place to start, but it's actually, this is a little trick that Nolly taught me. It's called top-down mixing, and you mix into a master bus, essentially a fake master. This is something that I've touched on before, but basically the idea is that your source tones are not really going to sound commercial. They'll be kind of dark, and they won't really sound the way that you would expect. And you might make a lot of moves on the mixing end, which actually will be addressed by the master bus. So this sort of saves you the trouble. Now, this is just a philosophy that I particularly like, but it doesn't mean that you have to do it this way. But since we're looking at the way that I approach this, let's look at my master bus. So pretty simple. It's just an EQ. Frequency is the Cubase EQ. We've got the Cubase vintage compressor here, which I'm using as my master bus compressor. We've got the Cubase limiter here. You'll see I have Magneto 2, but it's actually off. This is a saturation plugin, which my good friend Ermin will be very glad that I turned off because he hates it when people have saturation on their master bus. Truthfully, it wasn't really doing anything that I thought was benefiting the mix, so I just switched it off while I was experimenting. So the basic things that I like to do, and it may look like small moves. This is actually like a 30 dB scale, so all the moves will be relatively small because, see, that's already 3 dB. It looks tiny. But generally speaking, and I thought I had a... Let's do this right now. Generally, I will want to put a high pass filter just so that we tame the line. You don't want... You're not even really going to hear that, right? But it's just going to ensure that those low frequencies. The sub frequencies don't really get in the way of anything. What I will do, however, is boost a little bit around 100. 100 seems to be that kind of punch region. We can actually tighten up on this a little bit. This is an EQ I'm not like, I mean, actually the first time I've ever used it was prepping this project for this video. So it's I'm still kind of getting used to. It's not my absolute favorite EQ, but you can make anything work, honestly, especially as you learn it. So all these moves just look so small because of the scale. 100 is where you'll just get a lot of punch. So around 100, I'll want to do something just like a little bit of a boost. I'm actually scooping the whole mix a little bit around 500, and that really just gives you the effects of brightening it. Like a lot of mixes will sort of sound dull, just because source tones are kind of dull relative to what we expect. And then in line with that, I'm kind of doing a little high shelf over here. And it's a 3 dB high shelf. But if you want to hear the before and after, it's just sort of making it sound a little bit more hi-fi, hopefully in a pleasant way. Next thing that we've got here is the compressor. And I'm doing something a little interesting here. Normally I use the Slate Digital FG Gray, which is an SSL style compressor. And it's got a high pass filter or side chain, high pass filter or side chain. So basically you can tell it to ignore certain low frequencies. And this is again something that Nolly taught me, but what I'm doing is I'm making a sort of pokey snare sound on the way to the master bus, and then using the compressor as a way to duck the entire mix. This doesn't have a EQ side chain, so what I'm actually doing is I'm actually manually side chaining this. That's what these are from the kick and the snare. And generally what I'll want is about -3 reduction on the snare, just to kind of pump it back up. I want relatively quick attack, like 24 milliseconds, relatively quick release. Actually, so. Set that like that. And you can see it's ducking it. And that's just being sent from here. The kick is also being sent into that, and it's just ducking ever so slightly, just to create a little bit of that pumping effect there. This is something that I've done as a sort of makeshift way to get the same effect that I get from the FG Gray. We're doing a ratio of 4, quick attack, quick release, full mix, and just sort of dialing it in to get the reduction that I want. And finally, we've just got a limiter. This will actually soften the transients a little bit. I should probably show you what this sounds like with that. Here it's a lot flatter. It doesn't really have that movement to it. I like a mix that pumps just a little bit. And then the limiter is something where we're actually going to use it as a way to sort of cut the transients and also get some volume. I mean, I think the way this is gain staged, most of the volume is actually there. But this is going to chop all the pokey transients off. Hear how pokey that snare is? And I'm using the limiter strategically to smooth that out. There aren't a ton of controls on this. I'm sort of just leaving it as is. So that gives you a fair idea. That was clipping because the limiter was off. That's the other thing. It'll stop your mix from clipping. So moving right along, we have, let's start with the kick drum. So let's listen in on this, or not. Why do we have to? We have to actually be at a part where there is a kick drum. Apologies. So let's look at the kick drum. So you'll see that generally speaking, what I've got here is compression, EQ, and maybe some saturation. Compressor is to get the attack and the sort of punch that I want out of the source tone. The EQ is to EQ out all the frequencies I want. You'll see it's mostly subtractive EQ. And then Magneto is a saturation plugin. And that's one of those things that's a bit more advanced, a bit more color. It just adds a little bit of color. So let's listen to the kick by itself and let's deactivate these. So you hear what it's doing to the compressor. It's just giving it a little bit of, or the compressor is giving the kick a little bit of punch here. And then, now this is a big one. You can see these kicks are, there's not a whole lot of processing on our kicks, and it's so that you can shape them any number of ways. I'm shaping this more for a metal kick right now. There's a lot of mud in this sort of, 200, 300 region. So that's getting cut very, I mean, that's almost 10 dB of reduction. It's just, it's a pretty drastic difference, but just trying to cut out all the mud out of this. We're doing a little boost around 100. We're doing a high pass filter just to get rid of any excess sub. I'm cutting 500. It just seems to be a bit of a boxy frequency. And then up here, these frequencies here are just actually taming the click a little bit. The click of the kick drum. Because I want it to be more of this airy kick, and that's where the high shelf is coming in. That's the only additive EQ other than this slight boost at 100. And then here's the saturation. You can sort of hear what this does. It's subtle, but it's just adding this low mid sort of weight to it. This is one of those things that, I don't know, you don't need it, but I kind of have a little bit of fun with that. Let's move on to the snare. The snare, very similar. And again, I'm going for a snare, the snare sum itself. You know, I've got a good mix of bottom and top going in the plugin itself. But what I'm doing here is just trying to get some attack out of it. Got a fair bit of reduction there, right? And again, this is the thing is I know this sounds like a plug, and I guess it kind of is, but I really was just so happy with how Smash and Grab came out because it really just became the one compressor that we use for everything. So I'm trying to recreate a little bit of what I would get out of that one plugin with what's available here. I think this one's it's working pretty well, you know. But I'm pretty picky with my snare. So this is generally the kind of thing I would go for. Quite a bit of reduction. It's very, very pokey, but that's going to benefit us in a little bit. Next thing we've got is EQ. I'm actually adding quite a bit of weight to this. The 200 is kind of a boxy frequency, but it's just working. I usually would cut around 200, but it was just causing the snare to sound nice and fat, especially with the sample behind it. Then we're going to cut around 500. You can hear the difference with and without. That's without. Just cleans it up, just makes it more hi-fi, and we're boosting the top end. And then once again, this is up to you, but I just like what it does to the mid-range on the snare. Then the toms, very similar thing. Let's find a section that has here, we'll do this. Just a slight bit of reduction here. And this is where you can see how I like to use compressors sometimes. They just enhance the sustain a little bit. So with drums that have a lot of attack, like these toms, which are being hit pretty hard, you can actually just squeeze a little bit of the sustain out using a compressor. And then the EQ on the toms is really just meant to clean it up. Again, these frequencies here, 200, such a boxy frequency. 100, just a slight bit just to give it a little bit of weight. Taking out around 750, that's another frequency that can get kind of boxy. And this 2.1 tends to just give you a little bit of attack. Sometimes I'll add that on snare. And then just a high shelf just to make it sound hi-fi. So without. You just hear it just sounds a lot more hi-fi with it on. So now let's move on to the overheads. Now with overheads, and this is actually one of the good things about Invasion, you can do what I call hyper real stuff. You wouldn't, this would be kind of tough to do in real life. What I do is actually feed a lot of the snare to the overheads. I think it gives it this nice weight, and you know, it's a stereo image of the snare drum, so it just gives it a bit of width. And I like what it does. So I actually feed a lot more snare than you'd sort of be able to do in real life, but and just got just a little bit of compression here. I just feel like it makes the overhead sound a little bit more lively. So we're just going for about 3 dB, you know, quick attack and release. And I would actually normally cut a lot more low end out of this, except that because I'm putting some kick and definitely some snare in there, I don't really mind having these lower frequencies in there. So that's just the way I'm approaching it. Without. All right, is that the? There we go. That was the wrong one. So this is it. Without. I'm just boosting it, just make it a little bit clearer here. But yeah, so you know, it's cutting it up to 100 hertz, but normally you could do a lot more, honestly, but I want that snare to kind of come through on this. Moving on, we have the room. Now this I want to be kind of crushed, as you can hear. We got like 7 or 8 dB reduction, ratio of 8, fast attack and release. And again, I'm just crushing the rooms to try to get a bit of sustain. We're doing something again that's a bit hyper real here, where on the room I have a lot more snare and I don't really have any cymbals coming through. I have some toms going through. Not feeding very much to this. It's kind of a soft channel. I'm not using a ton in this particular mix, but I just want there to be a little more sustain. And because I wasn't feeding very much into it, I had to crank the input, so apologies. That's poor gain staging on my part. Bad, Misha, bad. Moving right on, we have... Let's look at parallel compression. That's a fun one. So parallel compression is a good way to get compression on just the parts that you want. And this is a really cool trick. So what you're going to do is, that's what these sends are for. And you can see I'm sending different amounts of each part of the kit to this parallel compressor. So if we listen to this, I'm compressing the kick and snare against one another, which is creating a really cool pumping effect. However, what I can do is not feed that much overhead to it and not get very much cymbal. That would normally interfere with everything. So this is allowing me to extract sustain. So there's two sort of sides to this kit. There's the attack side, and then the parallel compressor is where you sort of add the sustain back in. And to do this, I'm basically just taking this compressor here, super high ratio, fast attack, fast release. We're getting about what, like, yeah, 12 dB of gain reduction. So it's pretty crushed. And we're pitting that against the main mix. So with nothing, with way too much, I'm just sort of settling around there. Good little mix. So that's a really cool trick. Just a compressor on that to get that done. This channel here is something that I haven't really talked about before, and I don't really know. I'm actually approximating this. Normally I'd use a decapitator, which is a really cool sort of saturation plugin. Since I can't use that, I found this, which is Datube. And again, I'm doing parallel saturation. The magneto saturation it's more like tape saturation. It wasn't getting quite as grimy as I wanted. And this is sort of a grime channel right here. So I'm feeding parts of the kit, and you can hear like kind of ratty. But I'm not using very much. It's just a little bit. It's not working quite as well as when I've had decap in there. But it's something I was kind of playing around with. You can play, and this is maybe a bigger thing that you can see is how you can use parallel effects to your advantage, where you actually have different channels sending to it in the amounts that you want, you know, so you could see the amounts that are going to saturation. I don't have the room, or I do have the room, but I have completely different amounts here. And then this is a big one here, the reverb, which I normally put on the snare. So this I'm using Reverence. I just found this preset sounded pretty good. It seemed to work pretty well. Just killed a bit of the high end here. And I have mainly the snare going out into the reverb. But I saw Nolly try this, and I figured I'd try it out, and I was kind of happy with how it was sounding. So I actually fed a little bit of the room to it as well. And what I find this does is it kind of opens up the snare drum. So if you mute that. Now listen with. Just kind of opens up the snare just a little bit in the mix, you know? It's a subtle effect. At any rate, all these little things add up. I really firmly believe that everything that you do should be about small moves that all add up. There isn't any one move here that just makes all the difference. Hopefully by watching this, you're kind of seeing that for yourself. So that covers the drums right there. And then as far as guitar and bass, you know, guitar, I use the XFX3, pretty good source tone. So I just have EQ and a multi-band compressor. You might have seen me demonstrate these two things. So first, let's start with the EQ. Just getting a high-pass filter up just to get the sub and the gunk out of there is good. Again, boosting a little bit at 100, taking out at 200 because boxy frequencies, taking out at 500 because it actually leaves a little bit of space for the snare, in my opinion. At 750 as well, actually leaves a little bit of space for the toms there. And then boosting the top end, but then I've got a low pass filter at what, like 12K there. So without and with, just kind of cleans it up, scoops it a little bit, makes it sound a little bit more hi-fi. Now this is kind of a cool trick. I've definitely talked about this before. I believe Andy Sneap was the guy, or at least he's the first guy I heard of doing this, and it's a really cool trick. So on these palm mutes, you get a lot more low mid out of those. And what you could do is you could just EQ that out, or you could multi-band compress it out. And what that is basically compressing and giving you some gain reduction on just those frequencies, just when it needs it. So you could see this is doing like, it's a fair bit of gain reduction here, 7 dB, fairly high ratio, very fast attack and release. But it's just affecting this region where the palm mute sit. Now, this is actually a little bit easier to set. Normally, I use the Fab Filter Pro MB and their EQ. I love their EQ. Q3 is incredible. Q3 actually has multi-band compression built in, which is awesome. But the reason I mention that is because normally you have a scope here, which kind of helps you actually visually do it. So this I was doing by ear, and it seems to be working a little bit. I don't know if you can hear what it's doing on the palm mute specifically. It's kind of making it occupy the exact same frequency space as when it's an open string, which is not how the guitar would normally react. But what this does is mean that the guitar is always occupying the same amount of space in the mix. It's not changing whether you palm mute or not. So it's a cool little trick. It looks like, 150 to 420, yeah, is the region that I've got here that's getting reduced. So that seems to be working pretty well. Then on bass, use the Axe effects for this. So let's turn these off. Pretty good source tone. A lot of crazy EQ going on here. Taking out the absolute low end, boosting 100, make it big. Taking out the boxiness is very boxy here. Just controlling that low end, which is a little bit out of control. Controlling the top end, but giving it a little bit of air. And then this is a cool little trick here. Around 750, I find that you get this kind of grindy quality, so I always take like a small little Q and boost it up a little bit. It kind of makes the bass grind. It's really good in aggressive music. Kind of cuts through the guitars. And I was just playing around with a maximizer because, I don't know, it's kind of fun. I don't entirely know how maximizers work. This is where Nolly could probably give you a very detailed description of what's going on, but I thought it made it sound a little better, and I was having trouble getting the bass kind of cut through the way that I liked. But this when you have stock plugins, you experiment. I was able to make it work with what I had, so all together. Sounds pretty good. So yeah, that's a pretty basic tour of everything that's going on this mix. If you have the Invasion and you have Cubase, you could basically follow this along and get this exact same mix going on. So I hope that this has been informative, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.